Good evening, everyone. This is Rob. This is Rob from Truth, Prophecy, and Beyond. The other night, I put a video out, Proof of God. Well, tonight I'm going to answer that video by giving you absolute proof of the hand of God in modern day. We're not talking about the biblical times, like when Samson, armed with only a jawbone of an ass, killed over 1,000 Philistine soldiers. We're talking about the modern era, this century. I was alive, when this happened. Now, I'm not talking about when I died and walked in the spiritual plane, which you all know if you watched my other videos. I'm talking about, this is June 5th, 1967. Israel launched an all-out attack against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, the three major countries in the Arab coalition. The reason for this attack was because the Egyptian president, Sirhan, was boasting about how he was going to invade Israel and kill every man, woman, and child. Didn't matter if they were sick in the hospital. Didn't matter if they were pregnant carrying a baby. It didn't matter if they were old and afflicted. He vowed to all the Arab nations of the Middle East that he was going to kill every man, woman, and child in Israel. Well, this attack took place June 5th, 1967. What had happened is Russia had given false intel to the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Jordanians and a few other of the Arab countries that Israel was gearing up for an invasion. This was not true. Israel minds their own business. All they want to do is exist and live in their country, which is the Holy Land. Now, we all know through history and reading the Bible that God is going to protect Israel. And God is going to bless any nation that blesses Israel. That's the reason the United States has been so blessed since we began, because we have always blessed Israel since we became a country. That's why God has let the United States of America prosper as we have. Now, under the last administration, Obama, I won't even call him president because he wasn't a president. He was on a mission to destroy America. As a matter of fact, when he became in office, we went down to a AA credit. Now, America has never been a AA credit. We have been a AAA credit since we took world power in the 1800s, around 1871. Anyways, let me start out by giving you some of the facts. And then I want you to understand all these miracles. All these things happened all within 6 hours. This is why I'm telling you that the hand of God played in this. And once you hear the facts about the 6-day war, you'll agree with me. This was no doubt, it was the hand of God. That many coincidences, since I don't even believe in coincidence, it's all destiny. But that many cannot happen that rapid in that succession the way they did. Now, all the nations that belong to the Arab coalition constantly threatened Israel with annihilation. This has been going on since Israel became a nation in 1948. Well, it's been going on all the way back to the biblical days, but we're just going to go from when they were a country. Now, this was called the Six-Day War. Why? Because at the end of 6 days, now that's the number I want you to pay attention to. At the end of 6 days, all three nations, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, they all surrendered. Now, that's just like in creation. This is how God works. He works with numbers. 6 days, right? Creation, the seventh day, the Israeli soldiers rested. And they rested in their safe homes because they just defeated the three major Arab coalition countries that were trying to annihilate them. So they could go home and rest in peace without worrying about a bomb or somebody trying to kill them. That's the seventh day. The sixth day was the end of the war. Just like God did creation. He created the world. On the seventh day he rested. And that's exactly what the Israeli soldiers did. They started the war and they ended it by the sixth day. And then they rested on the seventh. Between Israel and Egypt, this war, unlike the 1952 Suez Canal War, that was between Israel and Egypt, where the British and French troops came to Israel's aid. Now, I'm going to tell you why the British and French came to Israeli aid. It was not the United Nations. The United Nations sat back and told Israel, we're not going to intervene. Okay, in 1952, the British and French did because they had economics. They had invested interest at that time that they would have lost if Israel would have lost the war. That's the only reason that in 1952 they came to Israel's aid. Now, the United States under Lyndon B. Johnson in 1967, when the war was fixing to break out, this was June 5th, the morning of June 5th, 8 a.m., told Israel, do not start the war. We are not going to intervene no matter what happens unless Russia intervenes with their troops and their military. So that's the only way the United States was going to intervene in this war. Now here is Israel, a country of only 2.5 million people at the time, surrounded by all Arab nations, many Arab nations, who all want their demise. They want Israel to be done, ended, end of story. Israel is sitting there and everybody in the world is watching because they think that these Arab nations are going to attack and that's going to be the end of Israel and every Jew in Israel will die. This is what the world did. I studied this years ago, and I remember thinking Lyndon B. Johnson and the United States Congress at that time were pieces of camel dung, because this is Israel we're talking about, people. This is the Holy Land, and this is God's people. God blesses those who bless Israel. Keep that in your mind. And it doesn't matter why you want to ask questions about it. It's just God. He said He'd bless you if you bless Israel. Now, this is a 6,000-year-old family feud between the Arabs and Israel. Abraham's 2 sons. That's how all of this started. His 2 sons. One became the nation of Israel. The other became the Arab nations. That's how this whole thing started. Why it came down to a shootout and a death match, I don't know. Only God knows. But that's what happened. Now, vastly outnumbered, Israel had no choice because Russia gave the Egyptians false intel. They told the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Georgians that Israel is going to invade. Well, that's not what was going on. Israel had no intention of invading. But when they saw the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Jordans gearing up, fixing to invade their country, they had no choice but to attack. So, the Egyptian leader, President Nasser, even though he lost the Suez Canal War to Israel, he became a very powerful man in the Arab states. He had a Hitler-type outlook against the Jews. He wanted to annihilate them all. Well, this made him very popular, and he had a lot of clout. So when he said jump, most of them jumped. Now this is where the first miracle takes place. Israel took off and headed towards Egypt to annihilate Egypt's air superiority. 5 air bases. Now, Egypt called up 40,000 reserve soldiers. Over the next few weeks, they called up another 100,000. This is why Israel attacked on June 5th. Egypt, Syria were calling up all these soldiers, all of this armor, all this anti-aircraft weaponry on the borders. Israel had no choice. They either sit back and become annihilated and their country would be taken from them, and most likely all their lives would be taken from them. So they attacked. When they attacked, 900 Soviet-made tanks and 1,000 artillery cannons. Nasser, instead of backing down, he provokes Israel into a declaration of war, ordering the United Nations peacekeeping force, at the time that was the first peacekeeping force, by the way, orders the United Peacekeeping Force to evacuate. Now, the Secretary of the UN, instead of questioning this order, just did what he said because he had a lot of clout. He pulled the peacekeeping force out of the area. Now, there's nothing standing in between these countries and Israel because the peacekeeping force has been disbanded and pulled out. Now, four days before the war starts, Levi Askell, the Prime Minister, okay, he is the Defense Minister of Israel, asked by the Israeli generals to step down because of his disastrous demeanor and the speech he made that morning before the attack began. The day before the attack began. Now that's the first miracle because this man didn't know beans. He would have sat back and watched Israel get annihilated. Now God moved a man in place to take his position and got him relieved of duty because he wasn't up for the job. That's miracle number 1. Now, Moshe Dayan, the military hero of the Suez Canal, was appointed as defense minister and created a plan within 24 hours. This was June 4th. He created a plan within 24 hours for Israel to attack and invade and take these Arab nations out before they could destroy Israel. That's the miracle right there, number 2. All right, so now you've had God relieve one man and put another man in his office. All right, now, June 5th, 1967, Israel Air Force takes off towards Egypt, hoping to destroy Egypt's air superiority, like I said. A Jordan radar tech witnessed Israel's jets taking off. This is miracle number 3. Jordanians and the Egyptians are allies. They correspond with each other regularly on military channels. Now, when the Jordan radar tech witnessed Israel's jets and bombers, he radioed Egypt trying to warn them, but guess what? The day before, the Egyptian military changed their codes. And the relay to the Jordanians telling them that the codes have been changed, broadcast on this frequency, they didn't get it. Now that's miracle number 3. Now this is all going on in a 6-hour period, right before they attacked. Alright, 200 Israeli jets flew over 500 miles an hour, only 30 meters above the ground, and several of them kept being picked up on the radar and fired at by the anti-aircraft guns. Egypt had been given by Russia, like I said, these guns all came from Russia. These are sophisticated, modern anti-aircraft weapons. Now, the Arab leaders came that day to inspect the anti-aircraft batteries and the airfields. The guns were given not to fire unless the order came from high command because of these Arab leaders coming in, touring the anti-aircraft gun site. Now, that's miracle number 4. Now, how do you account for all these things that happen within 6 hours like that? You can't account for it. There's no mistake like that, just one after another within a 6-hour period. This is the hand of God at work right here. This is what I'm telling you. This is not a coincidence. You don't have that many coincidences, especially during an attack of a war. You just don't. Everything is communicated on time and on time. Now, the aircraft jet was in the air due to the inspection. All right, now, that's one of the aircrafts that the Arabs were flying over their own guns, inspecting them, while I had a ground team doing the same thing. They were taking pictures of their installations, making sure everything was in place. That's the reason the guns were ordered not to fire. All right, now, here's miracle number 5. See, the 5 air bases were destroyed within 2 hours. This is a miracle in itself. Israel had antiquated jets against brand new MiGs. And they took off and they were outnumbered 4-1. But they destroyed all the air power Egypt had. Now, how do you account for that? That's God again. Now, all these things keep happening. Not only that, here's one that you can't deny. Normally, through the straits, it's very windy. On the day of the attack, there was virtually no wind to disrupt the Israeli bombs from their target. Now, if that's not the hand of God, I don't know what you call it. To me, this is God in action. All right, now, 280 jets and bombers were destroyed by the Israeli force. That's a lot of weaponry for 1967, especially for a country the size of Egypt. Now, in the next 2 hours, the Syrian Air Force was destroyed, and it only took one flyover to destroy the Jordanian Air Force. Now, all of this took place in 6 hours. This is the hand of God. And I love him. And I love the way he works. He is an amazing God. And he will always defend Israel. He will spank them when they need spanking, but he will defend them when it comes to annihilation. That's a guarantee. Now, at 8 a.m., Israel launches their tanks, and the Egyptians have modern Russian T-55 tanks. Israel only had leftover World War II Sherman tanks given to them by the Americans, us. All right? The Egyptian tanks outnumbered Israeli tanks 4-1. No, that's 4-1 again. That's good odds. All right, miracle number 6. After only 6 hours of fighting, Egyptian sounded retreat. They lost over 10,000 men and 700 tanks. That's a lot of men and a lot of tanks that were killed. The Israelis only lost 1,400 men and 60 tanks. Now, we're talking about a tank force here that outclasses the old World War II tanks by 20 years of technology. This is no way that old World War II Sherman tanks, outnumbered 4-1, can be defeated by a brand new, up-to-date, modern technology tanks. But they did. And it was the hand of God. Now, God took 10,000 lives, the Egyptian soldiers. We only lost 1,400, says the Israelis. And they lost 700 tanks. We lost 60, says the Israelis. All right, now, how do you do this? This is God, pure and simple. The Egyptian president got on the televised news and the radio station and was bragging that they were defeating Israel at every front. At this time in Israel, there were no Israeli TV stations in the area. The only TV stations were Arab TV stations. So if an Israeli had a television, they had to listen to Arab stations. So their people that did have the TVs are listening to the Egyptians are destroying Israel. It was a bunch of lies. But amazingly, Israel never denied it. Not only did they not deny it, they were jamming radio signals from the Egyptians, Syrians, and the Jordanians. They were tapping lines of the telephones. They had intercepted a telephone talking from Syria to Egypt and from Egypt to Russia. They were listening to conversations. And they kept up with everything that the Egyptians were doing. Now, at this time, let's see, Egypt president, boasting on television and radio, says he's defeating Israel, this draws the Jordanian infantry and tank squads into action. Israel defeats Jordan in 2 days. The whole army and all the tanks. Now, for the first time in 2,000 years, Israeli soldiers occupy Jerusalem. That's your last miracle. Now, this is where they took the holy city back from the Arabs, and they have not left it since that day, June 5th, 1967. This is what I wanted to bring to you. This was the hand of God. This was the proof of God, which I spoke about. I want each and every one of you to Google the miracles of the 6-day war. You will find Israeli soldiers talking about angelic beings interfering in combat, helping them. This is more proof of God. It's countless miracles happened in that war. I don't understand why the Arab nations can't just get it through their head. God is God, and He is the God of Israel, God of Abraham, Isaac. Yes, He is going to defend Israel at all costs. This is Rob from Truth, Prophecy, and Beyond. Tonight, you have witnessed the miracles in the 6-day war that was the hand of God. Y'all have a good evening. Rob signing out.